Hello and welcome to the School Safety Free Period. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
And we're with the Educators School Safety Network. We're a national nonprofit organization and we provide school safety professional development and technical assistance and consulting to K-12 schools. And then every once in a while, every week or every 2 weeks, we use this time to have a slightly less formal, slightly less serious discussion about what we're seeing in school safety and what we're encountering, and to be able to answer questions and to just have a little bit more of a free-flowing discussion about school safety.
Like you would do on your free period at school, where you maybe do a little bit of gossip, a little bit of venting, and then some collegiality and discussion of like the actual work.
Are we going to gossip?
Huh?
Are we going to gossip?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know that I have any hot gossip, to be fair. I don't know that I have anything prepared.
And it's too early in the morning that we're recording this, so I don't need to vent yet. It's too early for venting. See, people that have free periods at the beginning of the day probably have more collegial conversation than people that have free periods at the end of the day, when there's more venting and less collegial. Oh, there's a study right there. Anyone that needs a research study, there you go. So, but that's not what we were going to talk about today.
What were we going to talk about today?
Well, what I wanted to talk about today was the age-old question, but through the lens of school safety, the age-old question of why don't people do what you want them to? And so there's
how to win friends and influence people for school safety?
No, just why don't people do what you want them to? Especially when oftentimes we know what the real thing is, or what the right thing is, or what the best thing is, or at least we feel we do. And sometimes research demonstrates to us what the better thing to do is, or what a best practice might be to do. And that's true, I guess, for health and relationships and nutrition and everything else. But I thought maybe just to focus that down a bit, we might just talk today a little bit about why people don't do what we want them to do in terms of some of the best practices of school safety.
I think it might be helpful to maybe tell a little bit of the backstory of why were we having this discussion. You know, in the work that we do, we spend all of this time and we're focused so specifically about school safety and violence prevention and crisis management for educators, right? We have this very narrow focus. But a lot of the discussions, that we have after the fact, sort of informally debriefing, is oftentimes this thing is manifested as a school safety problem, but ultimately it's a leadership problem. So the long-running joke is it's not a X problem, it's a leadership problem.
Yeah, and that's a different podcast. But yes, that's a great point too. But I think in this particular case, it's not necessarily that there's a lack of leadership or a lack of incentivizing. It's more about the approach that a leader takes. So you may have a lot of good intention as a leader, whether you're the classroom teacher or the principal or a district leader. As an educational leader, you might have good intention, but if the approach is incorrect, it's not necessarily a leadership problem, but perhaps an approach or a perspective sort of problem. So actually, all of our listeners, you really should just ride around in the car with us, because this is really where we have most of our really great insights.
I think we need to start recording the podcast from the car. We got those nice microphones. Just cut it out, right? Get right to it.
When we're talking about things after a training or after a class or after a site visit, and that's when we're just really brilliant, is in the car, and then it fades after we get out of the car.
Especially extra brilliant. Yep.
But what I wanted to talk about was this notion of the frustration that people feel. A teacher feels looking at their students, or a principal feels looking at their teachers going, why don't you do the thing, blah, 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 that we want you to do? And in particular, when it comes to school safety, we hear that a lot of, why don't people wear their IDs? Why do people leave stuff all over the place that we know is an evacuation hazard, or why don't
Propping
people lock
doors.
the door when they're leaving the classroom? All of those things that we have talked about sort of in isolation at different times in the podcast and in trainings. And we were, this past weekend, we were sort of talking a little bit after a class about the whole idea of that why. Well, probably the most compelling reason why is because we haven't provided people with the rationale that makes sense to them, or an explanation that makes sense to them as to why it's important. And instead, we have just asked for compliance. So do this thing because I told you to. Do this thing because I told you to. Do this thing. And we know as parents and kids that that is the least motivational. Now, clearly, there is a place for doing things just because I told you to. So don't anyone get me wrong on that. But in terms of, if people are not doing something, let's say wearing ID badges, and we can't, we're constantly just saying, hey, you need to, and we're not getting that, then the first question needs to be, have we adequately explained a rationale as to why that's important?
And I would postulate that maybe we can even go back a step further. Have we clearly and consistently asked for that thing? Because I think sometimes in diagnosing some of these, the answer, well, have we set that as an expectation? Have we really asked and told people that? Even before you get to the rationale and the why, sometimes the answer is, well, we kind of did it one time and then we kind of sent mixed messages, or, well, we never really explicitly said exactly what we meant by that. We were like, maybe it would be cool if we wore ID badges. So I think to even before you get to, I think you're probably talking about the most critical component, but I think even more foundational is, did we really even ask or require or instruct this thing in
Or did you articulate that?
unequivocal terms? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Have you articulated the expectation? And then I guess if I'm going to build on that, so have we articulated the expectation? And then have we showed what that looks like? Have we modeled that? I think of that a lot with supervision. So I have an expectation that you're going to supervise, before school, after school, whatever that is. But have I also, in addition to, as you pointed out, articulating this is the expectation I have I also said this is what it needs to look like?
Mm-hmm.
Whether I've modeled that personally, which is fine, but also have I modeled that as in I've discussed the parameters of, I need the supervision to begin at this time, and I need it to look this way and be active,
Mm-hmm.
and I need it to cover this area. So I think if we're disappointed in the way people are not doing something or doing something, you need to articulate what your expectations are, show what it is you want to have happen, and then provide the rationale for why that's really important. So those three pieces, and then we sort of get to the ultimate one, and have I done enough support, training, education so that people really understand what they're doing, why, what that looks like? So have I really articulated all those things? And then finally, do I have some accountability for when it doesn't happen, as opposed to just either wishing or being irritated about it if it doesn't occur?
So it sounds like you're saying asking for it, right? Clearly and specifically, modeling it, showing exactly what do I mean by that. So yeah, I technically stood outside of I stood in my doorway during the change of classes. Technically, I was supervising it, and modeling what we actually mean by that, providing the rationale. And then you talked about training and, making sure that we're really answering all the questions and we're really have worked all the way through that. And then finally the accountability piece, or the, consequences or accountability. So, I mean, it sounds like it's kind of a pretty, easy framework in terms of, sorry, my dog is having a real trouble. I don't know if you could hear her coughing or not.
No, sorry.
Sounds awful in here. So it sounds like you're kind of articulating those, those 5 pieces. And I think, it makes sense. Like it would work across the different types of things that you're asking for, in terms of school safety concerns or school safety things that are undertakings, and also probably I would say in other aspects of instructional leadership or organizational management. And I guess my question is, how do you see that? We also often have the discussion when we're doing professional development of asking for, when you have sort of, here's something that's coming from leadership, right? Leadership is asking you to supervise in this way, and here's why. And then we always sort of ask of the folks that are, being tasked with this, that they cannot, suffer or stew in silence. That sort of, this isn't working. Here's a problem that hasn't been contemplated. How do you think that would sort of fit in to those kind of 5 steps of asking people, this is a continuously improving process, and the thing that I can't have you do is just cross your arms and go, doesn't work.
I mean, what is this final loop? The final step in the loop of continuous improvement is evaluation of, okay, you told me what it is you wanted. You explained why you wanted it. You modeled what it is. I know that I have to do it because I'm accountable for it. Then clearly sort of that next step is, and here's the things that are making it difficult for me to do that. That evaluation piece, which then becomes much more of a two-way flow of communication. And so I think that evaluation or assessment piece comes at the end of that loop, because there is the tendency, and I don't want to sound too negative, for people early on in the process to cross their arms and go, nah, it's not going to work. Nope, not going to work.
Right.
Can't. Standing in the middle of the hallway, nah, that's ridiculous. Not doing it. So I would postulate or encourage that evaluation piece of what's going to work or what's not working, or I need you to make an adjustment in your expectations thing, needs to come after we've actually tried to implement and begun to implement. Because otherwise we really sort of short circuit the process with the assumption that this is going to be a problem, the assumption that this is not going to work. So I think there's that. But what I'd like to kind of spend the little bit of our remaining time is, what is unique about this to school safety? And I guess one of the reasons why I was thinking about this topic and wanted to talk about it to begin with was just this idea of the consequence of not going through these steps. So you have an assumption that people are supervising because you've said, hey, we need to have more supervision, whether, whatever that looks like. And if I've skipped all the steps of, communicating about it, providing training, modeling, all the steps we've talked about, if I've skipped all those steps, I'm just living in this assumption that supervision is happening the way that I imagine it probably is, even though I haven't necessarily spelled that all out. And so I think part of the issue is the consequence of living in this kind of false reality where there's this big disconnect between what I think is happening and then what's actually happening, whether that's supervision or engaging with visitors, or the way that people are screened. And we see this so much in the work we do when we do field visits. What we are told by decision makers, whether it's the teacher saying, here's what my students do, or the principal saying, here's what my teachers do, or the superintendent, this is what my administrators do, there is often a big disconnect because all those steps got missed. People aren't doing what they want them to do, and they either know it and have given up, or they're assuming they have. And I think sometimes we sort of look the other way subconsciously because it just seems like such a constant sort of battle. And I think there's some really significant implications for safety there.
Well, and I think it's difficult either way. It's sort of a difficult problem either way. If you have your people who are, stewing and suffering in silence, or they're not able to comply for whatever reason, right? They're not able to engage in this thing for whatever reason. That's a difficulty. But
I don't see that. I'm a little bit less inclined than you are. You feel like there's all these people wringing their hands silently, can't decide what should I do. I feel like that might be a really small minority. I think it may be more the way you described it earlier, of people sort of crossing their arms and going, well, that's not working, so just not doing it.
Sure. Well, I guess what I was trying to say was, however small that minority might be, that problem is actually potentially more insidious, because at least if someone is saying, no, I'm not doing it, at least you understand that it's not happening. So I think you have a difficult problem either way. People who are unwilling to engage with the process, and about it. At least that's a thing that needs to be readdressed and reevaluated. But I think that there sometimes are people who are well intentioned, or for whatever reason a habit falls by the wayside. Not that they're silently upset that they can't do something, but a habit falls by the wayside, and that's just as difficult of a problem to address. That this thing is not happening for whatever the reasons are, whether it's defiance, or my plate is too full, or I have some sort of a legitimate roadblock that makes me unable to engage with this. Whatever the reason is, that's really difficult. And I think something that school leaders really struggle with is that the incentive structure for the people who work for you, who work with you, is to be able to say to you, yes, I'm doing the thing. We agreed we were doing it, and yes, I'm doing it. And so it's tough for people, unless you have a smaller majority who are like, I don't care what you think, I'm not doing it. For everybody else who maybe, it's just, I'm too busy, this doesn't seem like as big of a priority for me, but yet when the school leader asks or tries to observe, of course everyone's going to say, yeah, of course we're doing it. So it's very tough, and the incentive structures are not really built the way that we would be the most helpful.
Well, I think probably the most likely scenario is, I think of your analogy, or when we were talking few weeks ago when you were talking about physical therapy, and that you think you're doing your exercises for physical therapy, and then when you do it in the presence of a physical therapist, whether it's virtually that we were talking about or in person, the person goes, no, you're not. Yeah, you're doing it, but you're not doing it in a way that's beneficial. And so you do the exercises and go, yay, I did 20 reps of that. Why is my shoulder or my whatever not getting better? Because I was doing it not very effectively or not very well, because there wasn't this feedback loop of somebody going, no, that's not what that looks like. Nope, it should look this way. And if you're missing that component, then your teachers are going, well, of course I'm supervising. Right. I was leaning against my classroom door for the whole 4-minute passing period.
Yeah.
And so if we don't have that feedback loop as part of it, of all those steps we talked about, of what it should look like, and what the expectations are, and all those other pieces, but then there's also that feedback of somebody going, yeah, right, exactly, that's what that looks like, that's where you should be standing, that's how we want the IDs to be worn, or whatever the thing might be. And so all those little pieces, all of that create the habits that we're trying to make sure that we foster.
And I think this speaks to one of the most kind of things that we grapple with the most in terms of implementing and really having, systemic change in terms of school safety. It's for leaders to operationalize this. So it's great that a individual person knows what, here's what really, really good, really effective supervision looks like, both for preventing accidents or violence, but also for forming a relationship with kids and being aware of the, so I know what that is now. Great. How do we operationalize that? For change at a whole school or at a district level. And that's a different skill. Knowing what a best practice is great, and that's helpful, and that's part of continuous improvement. But then for school leaders to be able to operationalize that at a whole building, that's really the falling down point that we are really trying to address in a lot of the work that we do.
So the challenge, we always end with something like that, so the challenge is thinking about, so what's the thing that you're going, why won't people do this thing? Whether it's my students or whatever it is, what is this thing that people won't do that you think is, it's either driving you crazy, or you feel it's really a problem that it's not happening, or whatever. And then kind of taking some steps back and looking at, have I articulated really clearly the things we talked about? Have I modeled what that looks like? Have I provided the rationale? Have I provided the expectations and the accountability and that feedback loop? So I challenge you to kind of go back and look at that thing. Clearly we have the interest in that thing being related to school safety, but you may want to start with something much more small, just to kind of see how is it that we can actually make change, as opposed to just being frustrated all the time with a particular thing that's not happening.
Yeah. I think it's a good challenge, and I think it's a very manageable challenge. I think, to be able to implement that framework for something that you've been struggling with, and being able to have that being implemented with fidelity.
So now I think I'm going to apply that in getting things put away in the right place in the kitchen when someone else unloads the dishwasher. There you go.
Wow.
I'm gonna apply that to the thing that makes me crazy.
So first you called me out about not doing my physical therapy very well, and then I think maybe someone else is getting called out specifically about putting things away in the kitchen. Here you have it.
I'm not naming names, but when you find a place where something goes and then it doesn't end up there because somebody else has a different sense of where it should go, that maybe we need to follow that same. Have I articulated have I explained the rationale? I guess I could apply that to that.
Maybe you should get the pegboard like Julia Child, and then just have the outline. Everything goes on the pegboard, and then everything has a place that's clearly delineated.
I don't think that would make a difference.
Well,
and it's hard to put a pegboard in the dishwasher.
I think use the framework and report back. I think that's the best way to do it.
There we go.
You use the framework in that really inane application.
Dishwasher
all
of
the listeners will hopefully use it in something more important and impactful, and then we'll hear from everybody how it worked.
Okay, but like your free period, it always ends up going back to what drives you nuts at home too. So there you go. We've come full circle now.
Well, you can always shoot us an email if you have questions. We'd love to hear from you if this is something that you do in your school, and what it looks like, and what you've learned, and what worked and what didn't work. That's the feedback loop that we have here. The email is info@eschoolsafety.org. The website is eschoolsafety.org. We have lots of free resources and lots of information there. You can find all of the past episodes of the podcast, and you can always review and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. That does help us quite a bit. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer them. Anything else you want to add?
We'll see you next time.
All right, thanks.